My dear friends, let me invite us to be in order. This is not my first annual conference in the United Methodist Church, and I know what can tend to happen on the last day. I want to encourage your full engagement until we finish. I do believe it'll be at a reasonable hour, but in some sense, and in every important sense, that's in your hands. But it's doable if we choose to do it. But most of all, I want us to do it together, which means we didn't blow any smoke in your direction about the days and the time frame of annual conference. And it's possible for anything that could come up that you would want to be engaged in, the conversations that are still ahead of us. So here's the flow for the next couple of hours. We're going to have our final fearless talk from the stage, and you'll be encouraged and inspired because it's going to mirror back something of who you are in the life of the church and in the world. We will then turn our attention to dealing with the revote on a properly worded Constitutional Amendment 1, and then we'll get back to finishing up our own recommendations. We'll come to 6 first, and then to 4, which is the vacation policy piece. And I think there's a pathway to kind of get us out of the entanglement so that you can see some options in front of you. So let's turn to our friends in the fearless conversation, and allow me to offer a prayer as we begin. Thank you, O God, for letting us see and hear and feel so much of the activity of your Spirit at work through people and congregations and in communities across this world during these days. We open ourselves again and sit prayerfully in our tent doors and ask that you would speak to our hearts, that we might be more faithful in our service to you and to our neighbors. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Colton, Ohio is an Appalachian village in Jackson County in southeastern Ohio. It's the birthplace of Governor James A. Rhodes, big band leader Isham Jones, and most importantly, Colton is the home of the very first cash register. My little village is home to 479 people, give or take a few, depending on the day and the month. If you drive too fast, you just might miss us, and you just may get pulled over. We're nestled between Jackson and Wellston, where it has always been a heart-scrapple way of life. First, we had the coal mines. Colton had the finest coal in the country. Just ask us. Iron furnaces, salt licks, and timber. Now, most people make their living in food preparation plants, making between $8.30 an hour and $14 an hour, 40 hours a week, if they're lucky. Others make their living in the home health care aides or lower paying positions at hospitals or clinics. It's a very hard way to make a living, but these folks have managed to purchase small but very nice homes where they've raised their families. These hardworking people have scrimped and saved so that their children could receive a college education or at least have an easier, better life than they've had. These folks are smart, they're proud, and they are resourceful. July 2015, it was a hot one. It was a wet one. It was a miserable one. It had rained off and on for nearly 3 weeks, and the ground was so saturated that puddles were forming on the little hills. It was hot, it was humid, it was ugly outside. Then news came that another severe storm was headed our way. People were told that there could be flooding, but they had been told that for the past 3 weeks with no flooding. People went about their normal daily business because they had to get up and go to work the next morning. So they went home, they went to bed, they hoped for the best. Because I'm the mayor, I felt responsible to do all that I could do to ensure that the people who trusted me and counted on me were safe. And so we prepared the village as best we could. Around midnight, the storm came in. The lightning was intense. The thunder roared. And soon, the creek in my yard began to overpour its banks and started coming into my home. As I walked into my yard, the water was up to here, about right to here. I knew that if the water was that bad in my end of town, that another part of the village was in real trouble. And I was right. Since the storm came in the middle of the night, many people were awakened by rescue crews pounding on their doors, trying to get them up. Some people were being evacuated by boats. We did everything we could to get them out and to provide some type of temporary shelter. Some roads were impassable, and their cars and their trucks did flood. The rest of that early morning is pretty much a blur. Remember, the people of Colton are used to toughing it out. Sometimes we can be stubborn, just like our 90-year-old friend Duke. Duke refused to leave his home, even though he was standing in 16 inches of water with the electric still on. 16 inches of water, 90 years old with the electric still on. Finally, the sheriff came and was able to convince him by picking him up and throwing him over his shoulder that it was time to get out. Yeah. By 6 a.m., the water had receded and the damage was evident. It was very evident. A few homes were spared. Some had a few inches of water in them, while others had several feet of water. Septic tank covers had popped off and sewage was scattered everywhere in the yards and on the houses. It was everywhere. Of the 28 homes that were damaged, only 2 of those had flood insurance. Determined to give people some hope, we decided to act. We gathered up volunteers. We provided 16 dumpsters for the residents to throw away that which could not be saved. I will never, as long as I live, forget the look on their faces as they began to discard their clothes, their shoes, their furniture, their pictures, their lifetimes of memories. Many people lost cars and trucks, which left them with no transportation to the hospital, let alone to work or to the store. The fear of the unknown was setting in. They were asking me, when is help going to come? Hey, Kim, I don't have any insurance. I was told I wasn't in a flood zone and I didn't need it. Kim, I don't have any shoes and I don't have any way to get to the store to get any. That evening, reality really set in. People were sleeping in cars that had flooded out. One family of 4 slept in her dad's senior citizen's apartment. But after 3 days, they had to leave because by apartment rules, no one could stay more than 3 days or the father would be evicted. One family slept in the upstairs bedrooms of their home, even though the foundation of the home was unstable. As nights turned into day, fear began to turn into desperation. Soon after, anger. What's wrong with us? I'm a U.S. veteran. I pay taxes. I have never asked the government for a damn thing. When is help coming? In an emergency like this, I believe that Colton would receive help from the Emergency Management Agency, but instead, I soon found out that our little village had been bypassed. Colton had been forgotten. I called everyone I could think of. I was told that damage to our little village wasn't devastating enough to receive any assistance. How did they know? No one had been there. I know I really should not admit this, especially to a crowd this large, at a church conference, no less, but I lied. I lied to the people. I could not bring myself to tell them that our village did not have enough damage, that our damage was not bad enough. And I couldn't tell them that no help was coming, so I lied. I told them it was. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. I am not going to stop until we get some help, I promised. But our hearts were broken. I kept trying. I called all the agencies. I called all the nonprofits I could think of, but my calls went unanswered or unreported. All I could do to ensure that was to ensure them that they had done absolutely nothing wrong, that help was coming, and I kept calling government offices, nonprofits, emergency agencies, and the response was always the same. Not enough personnel now, no funds left. We're doing the best we can do. But finally, 2 days later, someone came in to assess the damage. Because the Colton folks had taken the initiative to begin cleaning up on that first day, we were told that there was not enough damage. You see, they wanted to see all the water lines and all the waterlogged, icky, moldy stuff that people were throwing away. We were cleaned up on the outside. I must tell you that after several sleepless nights and hours upon hours on the phone, pleading for help, I began to lose my cool. I called our commissioners and asked, why hasn't our flood been reported? I called the State Emergency Management Agency. I called our congressmen. I called our senators. I called, and I called, and I called. Finally, we had them all in Colton about 5 days later. But I want to tell you all, the very best part of all, Roberta Eddy from UMCOR showed up, yes. Our conversation went something like this. Hi, are you Kim? Yes. I'm Roberta Eddy from UMCOR, and I'm here to help you. I've looked through your town, and you've really cleaned it up. Do you think I could see some of the inside damage? Yes, you can. But these folks don't have insurance. They don't have money. They cannot afford for your company to come in and help clean their houses up. Sorry. If you know Roberta, she smiled with the most beautiful, warm hug of a smile. And she said, "It won't cost you a dime. We need to get those walls down. We need to see what damage has been done." And so it began. A day later, Roberta was there to take through the state EMA representative to look at the damage in the homes. She took the reins. The representative said we should have been declared a disaster area and that maybe we might be able to get some assistance. But I'll tell you what, I didn't care. UMCOR was already there. UMCOR brought in 10 crews of volunteers. They tore out water-damaged walls and replaced drywall. When it became apparent that some of Colton's residents could not afford the materials needed to do other work, Roberta and her team applied for UMCOR grants, which they received, thank God. They even helped with personal donations of materials. Roberta and UMCOR saved 10% of Colton's homes from being demolished. Most importantly, Roberta and UMCOR volunteers brought a sense of hope that had been lost in those floodwaters. Our residents started to see the light. They began finding clothes. They began making plans. They were able to figure out their transportation and how to return to work. They were able to get on with their lives. Roberta and UMCOR restored our faith. And for that, the people of Colton will be forever grateful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joe Blundo. It's an honor to be here today speaking to you about disaster relief work. In June 2016, parts of West Virginia were hit by more than 10 inches of rain in a few hours. Entire houses were swept away and more than 20 people died. It's what's called a 1,000-year storm. The little town of Clendenin on the Elk River near Charleston is still recovering 2 years later. I've been there 4 times with the youth and adult work mission teams for my church, North Broadway United Methodist. On that youth trip last summer, so that would be 1 year after the storm, Susan Jack, the coordinator of disaster relief in Clendenin, told us about a family that was living on a hillside just outside of town in a small mobile home. During the storm, the little creek that ran in front of their house turned into a torrent, and they had to flee for their lives, as did most of their neighbors. About 20 people crammed into a small house on a nearby hilltop and waited 2 nights for the water to recede. Of course, the family's house was heavily damaged, and their best hope of getting it restored was with volunteer groups like ours. See what you can do to help this family get back to normal, Susan told us. They've been waiting a long time. When I walked into that home, I felt mostly overwhelmed. It was a jumble of construction equipment and partially completed rooms and dust, and you know how it is. Blankets were doing not such a great job of protecting the furniture. And there were what appeared to me to be miles of drywall seams to mud and sand. And if you've ever sanded drywall, you know that a lump this big raises a dust storm worthy of the Sahara Desert. I was afraid we were simply going to add to this family's distress. But the first thing they tell you in disaster relief work is the most important skill you can bring to the job is listening. Listening. If people want to tell you their stories, and often they do, you should leave the tools in the truck, sit down, and listen. And so we did. We learned that Bobby, the mother of the house, had had a bad experience with a previous volunteer group. They were rude and dismissive and kind of judgmental about the conditions in the house. That's a key piece of information. We learned that Bobby had almost died of an infection the year before the storm. We learned that Bobby's mother was severely injured in a car accident some months after the storm. We learned that Bobby's son, 15-year-old Tyler, had to switch high schools because his was destroyed in the flood. He'd been sleeping on the couch in the living room for 6 months amid sheets of drywall and lumber, etc. And he couldn't have friends over because the house was, in chaos, basically. We learned that Bobby had one immediate goal. She wanted Tyler to get his bedroom back, so he'd have some semblance of normal. It wouldn't solve every problem she had, but it would be a milepost she could hang on to. So our little work team consisted of 3 adults and 4 high school students. And the high school students bonded very quickly with Tyler. They had a mutual love of hip-hop music. We listened to a lot of hip-hop that week. But seeing her son having a good time with kids his own age, kind of back to normal, I think did almost as much for Bobby as anything else we did in her house. She sat most days on her front porch trying to stay out of our way. This was a very small place. There wasn't barely room for her family, let alone 7 workers. So she was trying to stay out of our way. But we let her know she was in charge. We didn't move things without asking her. We didn't go to lunch without telling her when we would be back. We tried not to be so busy helping her that we failed to connect with her. Well, we met her goal. Tyler's room was sanded, painted, and ready for his bed by the end of the week. We also made progress in several other rooms. We even managed to fix some things that weren't on the list. On the last day of work, for late Friday afternoon, after we packed up the tools, we all gathered in the driveway and took pictures. And Bobby cried when we left. So what made all that possible? It was recognizing that when it comes to helping a neighbor, there was enough. There was enough love, enough patience, enough resources to do the job. Now, for North Broadway's adult mission and youth mission teams, enough starts with a congregation that supports us, supports the work. Not everyone can spend a week in another state cleaning up after a flood, but we find people still want to participate. They want to be involved. And they are. They prepare flood buckets. They come to our fundraisers and eat our spaghetti and buy our silent auction stuff. A few quietly give us generous sums of money. They send us off with prayers and ceremonies to reinforce the fact that they think what we're doing is a very important ministry of the church. Something about disaster recovery work is infectious. It builds momentum on itself. More and more people have volunteered to get disaster relief training since we made our first adult mission team trip in 2006, right after Hurricane Katrina. Someone knew of a trailer that was not being used and was given to us, and we filled it with our tools and pulled it thousands of miles. We got a grant. We didn't ask for a grant. We didn't know a grant was available. We got it anyway. And we used it to buy supplies. And then when we arrive in disaster areas, we find that the generosity often continues. People cook meals for us. They invite us into their homes to take showers. Businesses give us discounts to express their appreciation. One summer in Pomeroy, Ohio, I was given homemade ice cream in 2 different places by 2 different people on the same day. It was hot, and I must have looked like I needed ice cream. All of which is to say that, yes, there is enough. There are enough resources and enough skills in almost any congregation to make an impact for 2 reasons. People want to help disaster victims. They have a problem we can all identify with. Their house is in an uproar. It's a mess. And we can imagine what it would be like to live in a place like that with no immediate prospects of getting it fixed. Second reason is there's enough within most of us, all of us, to make a difference. I'm not a professional handyman. Actually, I'm not even an amateur handyman. I know how to do a few construction things. But even if I didn't, I think I could still lend a hand. If you can drive, if you can cook, if you can clean, if you can organize, if you can fundraise, if you can just sit with a stranger in trying circumstances and connect with that person, you might have just the gift needed in that situation. And when I say that, my mind always goes to Whiteville, North Carolina. We took a youth group down there some years ago to do home repairs after Hurricane Floyd. So one of the residents of Whiteville invited us to his lake house on a Thursday night for a fun night in appreciation of us being there. And we went, and the kids were having a great time. They went swimming, and they were having fun. There was a trampoline there, so the kids were bouncing on the trampoline. And one young lady's foot slipped off the mat and got stuck in the springs on the side, and her leg snapped. And you could hear it. Well, some people, of course, immediately ran for help. Some people stood there in shock, not sure what to do. Some turned away in horror. But there was one young lady, a high school student, who just instinctively recognized what somebody needed to do right now. She crawled onto the mat, gently crawled over to where the injured student was laying, obviously in pain. And she just took her hand and talked to her in the calmest, gentlest voice. Just said, "Don't worry, everything is going to be all right. Help is on the way. Your friends are here to help you. We'll take care of everything. It's early in the summer. By the time school starts again, your leg will be fixed. You'll be all back to normal. Don't worry." I don't know how good that kid was with a hammer and drill that week. All I know is she had the right gift when we needed it, and it was a blessing. ERT stands for Emergency Response, Early Response Training, ERT. You may have heard of it. You can arrange it through the West Ohio Conference. The training takes about 8 hours, usually on a Saturday. You learn practical stuff like how to put a tarp on a damaged roof, how to kill mold, how to remove wet drywall from a house. And you learn the one tool you must never fail to bring to a job, and that is a flexible attitude. Before we go on these trips, we gather as much information as we can about what jobs we might be doing so we have the right tools and so forth. And often we get there and find out we're not doing any of that. It's just the nature of these disaster areas. There's some chaos, some confusion. Things do go wrong. There are false starts. Someone will be driving in Mississippi looking for an address and end up in Louisiana. Actually, I did that, but yeah. But it was okay, because I've learned that if you hang with it, things ultimately will go right. We were in the Houston area in February, where Hurricane Harvey hit. 10 inches of rain in West Virginia, 4 feet of rain near you, 4 feet of rain, if you can imagine that. Once again, a homeowner who'd been waiting months, her house had been inundated. And once again, a feeling of being overwhelmed. More miles of drywall seams. They seem to follow me. So there's always a little bit of apprehension when you get started. But, we stayed flexible. We hung with it. And at the end of 5 days, that homeowner walked in and saw walls almost smooth enough for paint. It was getting close. And wood trim installed all throughout the house. One of our volunteers had put in a water heater for her. And she was moved to tears. Disaster victims, they just want one thing. They want to go home. And if you can help them get there, their gratitude will be profound. I can tell you that I have never done anything, inside a church or outside of it, that felt more like loving my neighbor than doing this kind of work. Truly. I can also tell you there will never be a time when it won't be needed. Because you know the news, you see the news, hurricanes, floods, fires, even volcanoes now. There's always something going on that's going to victimize some people. And the recovery from these things takes years, long after the government goes home, and long after the news media moves on to more photogenic opportunities. Faith-based organizations, most notably the United Methodist Church, will be in these places helping people get their lives back together. Whether by going there yourself or supporting people who do, you can be a part of that. I hope you'll join me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe and Kim. Our fearless speakers have invited us to join God out in the world, where people often wonder if they matter, if their life really has any value. And as Jesus followers, we know that God does see value in each and every person and yearns for us to see that too. Scarcity is a myth. There is no limited supply of love, grace, forgiveness, and redemption, and there is room for everyone. But we have to choose to be generous with our welcome and hospitality, so that anyone can experience the miracle of faith. Our fearless speakers have inspired us with their stories and their authentic witness. But if we just stop at being inspired and don't move into action, we have squandered the power of the Holy Spirit. It is time for us to do something. Faith is not an inanimate object. It is a life force infused with gifts from the Spirit that flows through us, intended to make a difference. All of God's people are called. Pay attention to the calamity that's all around and love with reckless abandon. Think enough about another person to learn her name. Hear his story. God's Spirit is calling us to cross the many invisible borders that separate us from people who are not like us. People are waiting, and it's up to us to decide if we truly do believe that with God, all things are possible. And you won't have to figure this out all on your own. One of the things we have committed ourselves to is we are taking these fearless presentations and we'll be creating small group resources that we hope will be available to congregations this fall. In the meantime, though, you don't have to wait. Take the risk. You'll make mistakes, and that's okay. Risk anyways. Risk seeing the invisible people in your neighborhood. Hear their cries, whether loud, muffled, or silent, because they're real. Slow down enough to be present, and dare to love them as Christ has loved you. So follow God's Spirit into the world and be open to miracles, even within your own life. It's time to do something.